I turned 35 yesterday. There were no balloons, no cake, and absolutely no warm wishes. Instead, my father slid a thick, legally binding invoice across the table at a five-star steakhouse. The total was exactly $525,000. The itemized charges included my childhood groceries, middle school math tutoring, and what my mother categorized as the emotional toll of raising a difficult daughter. They demanded immediate payment. And before the appetizers even arrived, my younger sister reached into my purse and took the keys to my car. I walked out into the pouring rain that night with nothing but my phone. Today, they are blowing up my phone begging for mercy. But they have no idea that handing a forensic accountant a fake invoice was the biggest mistake of their lives. My name is Lauren, and I am 35 years old. For my entire life, I was the quiet one, the peacemaker, who paid her own way, just to avoid the endless drama my family thrived on. Before I tell you exactly how I audited my own parents and uncovered a web of lies that destroyed their perfect country club facade, let me know what city or country you are watching from down in the comments below. And if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, while the golden child got everything handed to them on a silver platter, please hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you are going to want to hear how this ends. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago, our family projected an image of absolute perfection. My parents, Thomas and Susan, cared about two things above all else: their status at the local country club, and my younger sister, Amanda. Amanda was the golden child. She was 3 years younger than me, but she dictated the mood of our entire household. If Amanda was happy, the house was peaceful. If Amanda was upset, someone was going to pay, and that someone was usually me. I learned early on that my role was to be invisible and self-sufficient. I paid my own way through state college by working double shifts at a diner, while my parents threw a lavish $100,000 wedding for Amanda and funded her 3 failed business ventures. I became a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud and asset tracing. I track hidden money for a living. I look at spreadsheets and find the lies people try to bury. It is a lucrative career, and it allowed me to build a comfortable, independent life, completely separate from my parents and their constant financial bailouts of my sister. I kept a polite distance from them, attending major holidays and birthdays, just to keep the peace. But I never expected them to weaponize my own birthday against me. The invitation for my 35th birthday dinner had actually surprised me. My mother called a week prior, her voice dripping with an unusual sickly sweetness, insisting that we celebrate at an upscale steakhouse downtown. She said it was time we gathered as a family to honor my milestones. I should have known better. I wore a nice dress, bought a new pair of heels, and arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. The dining room was dimly lit, smelling of expensive wine and aged beef. The chandelier above our reserved booth cast a warm glow, but the moment my family arrived, the temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father, Thomas, wore his tailored suit, carrying the arrogant posture of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into, despite the fact that his logistics company had been struggling for years. My mother, Susan, was draped in designer jewelry, her perfect blonde hair stiff with hairspray. And then there was Amanda sitting across from me, already complaining about the valet service. Her husband Derek sat next to her, checking his phone and completely ignoring my presence. The waiter poured our water and handed out the leather-bound menus. I smiled, trying to force a pleasant evening. I thanked them for organizing the dinner. My father did not smile back. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He did not say happy birthday. He did not hand me a card. He simply slid the envelope across the pristine white tablecloth until it hit my water glass. I looked at the envelope, then up at him, confused. I asked him what this was. My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping into a cold, business-like tone. She told me to open it. I peeled back the metal clasp and pulled out a stack of stapled papers. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, "Invoice for upbringing and maintenance payable upon receipt." I blinked, sure I was misreading the document, but as my eyes scanned the columns, my stomach tied itself into a heavy knot. It was an itemized list. It started from the year I was born and went all the way up to my 18th birthday. They had calculated everything. There was a charge for the hospital bill from my birth. There were columns for groceries estimating my portion of the household food over 18 years. There was a $10,000 charge for piano lessons I was forced to take and hated. There was a section titled Educational Support, which included the cost of public school supplies and a brief stint with a middle school math tutor. But the most staggering section was at the very bottom. It was labeled Emotional Toll and Disruption of Parental Lifestyle. They had literally assigned a massive monetary value to the inconvenience of raising me. The grand total, printed in bold red ink at the bottom of the final page, was $525,000. I sat there in the middle of a crowded, noisy steakhouse, the clinking of silverware and soft jazz music suddenly fading into the background. I looked at my mother. I asked her if this was some kind of sick joke. Susan did not flinch. She took a sip of her sparkling water and set the glass down delicately. She looked me dead in the eye and said that I was 35 now, a grown woman with a successful career. She said they had sacrificed their best years and their financial stability to provide for me, and it was time I paid my debts. She explained without a hint of shame that Amanda and Derek were looking to buy a new luxury home in a gated community, and they needed a substantial down payment. My parents had decided that the money I supposedly owed them for raising me would be the perfect way to fund my sister's dream house. "You think raising you was free?" Lauren, my father, chimed in, leaning back in his leather chair. "We gave you life. Now it is time to balance the ledger." The sheer audacity of their demand paralyzed me for a moment. They were billing me for my childhood existence to buy my spoiled sister a mansion. I looked over at Amanda. She was not looking at the menu. She was staring at me with a smug, entitled smirk, entirely unfazed by the insane extortion happening right in front of her. She actually looked bored. I took a deep breath, trying to control the shaking in my hands. I carefully placed the papers back into the manila envelope. I told them I was not paying them a single dime. I told them parents are legally and morally obligated to care for their children, and that billing your child for groceries is not only insane, it is legally unenforceable. I grabbed my purse to leave. I was done with this dinner, done with this family, and done being their punching bag. But as I shifted to stand up, I realized my purse felt strangely light. I looked down and saw the zipper was open. Before the conversation had even started, while I was distracted by the menu, Amanda had reached across the table and taken something. I looked back up at her and my heart stopped. Dangling from her manicured fingers were the keys to my Audi Q5. I demanded she hand them back immediately. My father just smirked and took a sip of his wine. He calmly informed me that he had gone to the DM5 and transferred the title of the car entirely into Amanda's name that very morning. When I was 22 and barely scraping by, I had foolishly put the car under his name to qualify for his multi-car insurance discount, even though I had personally paid every single $600 monthly installment for years. Legally, on paper, it was his car to give away. Derek laughed from across the table and told me to just call an Uber so I would not make a scene and ruin Amanda's night. I stood there absorbing the betrayal. I did not scream or cry. I left the envelope on the table, turned around, and walked out of the restaurant into the freezing rain, leaving them to pay for their own expensive dinner. They thought they had left me with nothing. They had no idea I was already planning my audit. The freezing rain soaked through my silk dress before I even reached the corner of the street. I did not look back at the steakhouse. I stood under the flickering street lamp, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders, and pulled out my phone to order a ride. My fingers were numb from the cold, but my mind was running at 1,000 miles an hour. I looked across the wet asphalt toward the restaurant entrance just in time to see the valet jogging through the rain to retrieve a car. A moment later, the sleek white body of my Audi Q5 pulled up to the curb. My heart pounded hard against my ribs as I watched the passenger side door open. Derek climbed in first, laughing at something his wife had just said. Then Amanda slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors of the car I had paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I watched the red taillights of my own vehicle fade into the rainy night, leaving me completely stranded on my 35th birthday. My rideshare arrived 10 minutes later. It was a worn-out sedan that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. I climbed into the back seat, shivering as the cold leather touched my damp skin. As the driver pulled away from the curb, my phone screen lit up. It was a text message from my mother. It read, "You are acting incredibly immature, Lauren. We are trying to have a nice evening to celebrate your birthday, and you storm out over a simple financial discussion. We expect an apology by tomorrow morning." I stared at the glowing words for 3 seconds before I blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Amanda and Derek. I needed absolute silence from them to execute what I was about to do. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed Megan. Megan was a senior auditor at my firm and my closest friend. She was the only person in my life who truly understood the toxic dynamic of my family. She answered on the second ring, loud background noise indicating she was out at a restaurant. "Hey, birthday girl," Megan shouted over the noise. "Tell me you are drinking champagne and eating an incredibly expensive steak right now." I leaned my head back against the cold window. "I am in an Uber," I said quietly. They handed me a bill for $525,000 for raising me, and then Amanda stole my car. The background noise on Megan's end instantly vanished as she walked outside. I could hear the wind brushing against her microphone. She asked me to repeat what I had just said because she was sure she had misheard me. I did not cry. I recounted the entire dinner to her with the clinical precision of a crime scene investigator. I told her about the manila envelope, the itemized invoice, the charges for my middle school math tutoring, and the absurd line item for the emotional toll of my childhood. I told her my parents wanted the money to fund the down payment on Amanda and Derek's new luxury house. Megan was silent for a long moment before she let out a sharp, incredulous breath. "Lauren, that is legally insane. They cannot bill you for groceries you ate when you were 8 years old. Parents have a legal duty to provide for their children. No court in this country would ever uphold that ridiculous piece of paper. I know they cannot enforce it," I replied, my voice steadying as the initial shock morphed into a burning, focused anger. But the invoice was just the distraction. While I was staring at the fake bill, Amanda reached into my purse and took the keys to my Audi. "My dad transferred the title to her this morning." Megan gasped. "Lauren, that is grand theft. Call the police right now and report the car stolen." I shook my head even though she could not see me. "I cannot just call the cops." When I was 22 and fresh out of college, my insurance premium was nearly $400 a month. My dad offered to put the car under his name to get a multi-car discount. I paid the $600 monthly note directly from my checking account to the lender for 5 years. I paid for all the maintenance. I paid for the new tires. But strictly on paper at the DMV, his name was on the title. He legally gifted it to Amanda today. There was another heavy pause on the phone. Megan knew exactly how hard I had worked to buy that car. I had pulled 80-hour weeks tracking offshore accounts just to afford the down payment. Meanwhile, Amanda was constantly showered with gifts. Our parents had handed her $100,000 for a dream wedding and then bailed her out 3 separate times when her boutique clothing businesses went bankrupt. Amanda never worked a full day in her life, but she was currently driving my car to her beautiful home. "So, what are you going to do?" Megan asked, her tone shifting from shocked to purely professional. "Because I know you, Lauren. You are not going to just let them walk all over you like this." I opened my work laptop right there in the dark back seat of the moving car. The bright screen illuminated the damp fabric of my coat. I connected the laptop to my phone's cellular hotspot. "I am going to do what I do best," I told her, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to access our firm's secure virtual private network. "I am going to audit my own family. My dad's logistics company has been bleeding money for years. I have seen his house falling into disrepair. He cannot afford to buy Amanda a new house, let alone float her lifestyle. There is missing money in their financial history, Megan. I know there is. And I am going to find it. I ended the call and opened a secure messaging application on my desktop. I typed in the name David. David was our firm's private investigator, an absolute bulldog who specialized in tracing hidden assets for corporate divorce cases. He was expensive, ruthless, and incredibly efficient. I typed out a quick message. David, I need an emergency asset background check, full priority. I need every bank account, property, deed, mortgage, and shell company attached to my father's legal name going back 15 years. I attached my father's social security number, which I had memorized from filing his taxes when I was a teenager. I also included the tax identification number for his failing logistics company. David's reply popped up 30 seconds later. Consider it done. You will have the preliminary report on your desk by tomorrow morning. I closed the laptop and watched the rain streak across the window as the car pulled up to my townhouse. I walked up to my front door, my clothes soaked and my feet aching in my expensive heels. The house was completely dark and quiet. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and dropped my wet coat on the floor. I did not turn on the television. I did not pour a glass of wine to numb the pain. I walked straight into my home office, turned on the bright overhead lights, and brewed a massive pot of coffee. It was close to midnight, but I knew I was not going to sleep. The next morning, the sun broke through the gray clouds, casting bright light onto the stacks of paper I had already printed. I was sitting at my desk drinking my third cup of coffee when my computer chimed with an incoming email. I expected it to be the report from David. Instead, the sender name made my blood run cold. It was from a corporate law firm downtown. The subject line read, "Urgent legal demand regarding outstanding debt." I clicked the email open. The message was from an attorney representing my father. The lawyer wrote that my parents were officially demanding immediate payment of the $525,000, and if I did not agree to a structured payment plan within 3 business days, they would file a formal lawsuit against me. But it was the attachment that caught my absolute attention. The lawyer had attached a scanned PDF document to back up their claim. The file was named Promissory Note Executed. I opened the attachment and stared at the screen. It was a formal legal contract dated exactly 17 years ago, right around the time of my 18th birthday. The document stated that I formally acknowledged the financial burden my parents took on to raise me, and that I promised to repay them upon reaching financial stability in my career. And right at the bottom of the page, resting on the signature line, was my exact signature in blue ink. I zoomed in on the signature. It looked flawless. The looping cursive of the letter L and the sharp angle of the letter N were perfectly matched to my handwriting. For a brief second, I questioned my own sanity. Had they manipulated me into signing something like this when I was a naive teenager? Had they slipped this paper into a stack of college loan documents and told me to just sign at the bottom? But panic is the enemy of a forensic accountant. I took a slow breath and focused my eyes. I am trained to look past the surface of numbers and words. I am trained to look at the anatomy of a document. I right-clicked on the PDF file and extracted the raw metadata. Then I magnified the main body text of the contract to 400%. I looked at the specific curves of the lowercase letters and the spacing between the vowels. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time since my birthday began. The font they used for this supposed 17-year-old contract was Calibri Light. My parents were not very smart criminals. Microsoft did not release that specific font variation to the public until years after the date stamped at the top of the paper. My parents had forged a legal document, and they had just sent it to me across state lines via an attorney. They had just committed federal wire fraud. I sat back in my desk chair and let out a harsh laugh that echoed in my empty townhouse. My parents thought they were so clever. They thought they could bully me into submission with a scary-sounding letter from a strip mall lawyer. But they had just handed a forensic accountant a smoking gun. Still, I knew I could not reveal my hand just yet. I needed them to feel completely in control. Arrogance breeds carelessness, and I needed them to be as careless as possible over the next few days. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. I had blocked her the night before, but I unblocked her just for this performance. It rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice was sharp and impatient. "Lauren, I hope you are calling to apologize. Your father is extremely upset." I forced my voice to tremble. I made my breathing sound shallow and panicked. "Mom, please," I said. "I just got the email from Dad's lawyer. I am terrified. Please do not sue me." I could practically hear the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. Susan let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Well, Lauren, actions have consequences. You walked out on a family dinner and refused to acknowledge your financial obligations. What did you expect us to do? I do not have $525,000 sitting in my checking account," I stammered, pouring on the desperation. "I need time. Please, Mom. Just give me a few days to look over my finances to see what kind of payment plan I can afford. Please do not take me to court." There was a long pause. I knew she was covering the receiver to whisper to my dad. Finally, she came back on the line. "Fine. We are not monsters, Lauren. We will give you until Friday afternoon. But if we do not have a signed agreement and an initial wire transfer, by then the lawsuit moves forward. Do not test us." She hung up. I dropped the phone onto my desk and my trembling hands immediately steadied. The terrified daughter act was over. I had just bought myself exactly 72 hours to tear their financial history apart piece by piece. I turned my attention back to the absurd itemized invoice my father had given me at the steakhouse. I needed to understand why he picked that specific number. $525,000 was an oddly precise amount to extort from your own daughter. Fraudsters usually pick round numbers, or they base their extortion on a specific hidden debt they need to cover. I cross-referenced the dates on his invoice. He claimed the most severe financial hardship happened during my college years, specifically between my sophomore and junior year. He claimed he took out massive personal loans to keep a roof over my head, but my preliminary report from David, the private investigator, had already populated in my secure inbox. I opened David's file and started scrolling through my father's asset history. I matched the timeline of my dad's supposed financial ruin to his actual bank records. Suddenly, my hand stopped moving over the keyboard. The numbers on the screen did not make sense. Right in the middle of my junior year of college, during the exact same month, my dad claimed he was drowning in debt because of me. His business bank account showed a massive, unexplained deposit. It was a wire transfer for $1.5 million. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the origin routing numbers of the wire transfer. It came from an escrow account managed by a corporate law firm in Boston. I ran a quick search on the law firm and the breath caught in my throat. It was the exact firm that handled my late grandfather's estate. My grandfather Theodore had passed away when I was 19. He was a self-made real estate developer who had always favored me because I showed an actual interest in his business, unlike Amanda, who only cared about shopping and country club gossip. At his funeral, my parents told me that his estate was completely tied up in commercial debt and there was absolutely nothing left for the family. I had mourned his loss and never asked a single question about the money. I immediately logged into the county clerk's digital archives. I paid the $40 expedited search fee and pulled the original trust documents from my grandfather's estate. The heavy digital file loaded slowly, revealing pages of dense legal jargon. I scrolled past the standard provisions until I found the disbursement schedule. My grandfather had set up an irrevocable trust. The stipulations were crystal clear and legally binding. The $1.5 million was never meant for my parents. It was a direct inheritance meant to be split evenly between his 2 granddaughters. $750,000 for Amanda and $750,000 for me. The funds were explicitly scheduled to be released to us upon our 25th birthdays. I sat in complete silence, processing the magnitude of the lie. I had spent my entire 20s eating cheap ramen noodles, working exhausting double shifts at an accounting firm, and panicking over my student loan payments. I had sacrificed sleep and a social life to build my career completely unaware that I was the rightful owner of $750,000. But how did my dad get the money into his own account? An irrevocable trust requires the beneficiary's direct signature to authorize an early disbursement or a transfer of funds. I pulled up the secondary documents from the county public records, downloading the signed release forms from over a decade ago. There it was. A formal legal release document authorizing the trust manager to wire the full $1.5 million directly into my father's logistics company account. On the bottom left was Amanda's signature. On the bottom right was mine. I stared at the blue ink on the glowing screen. It was the exact same flawless forged signature they had just used on the fake promissory note that morning. My parents had not just stolen my car. 10 years ago, they had forged my name on a federal financial document and stolen $750,000 that legally belonged to me. I dug deeper into David's investigative report, tracing exactly where the stolen trust money went after it hit my father's failing business account. The paper trail was incredibly sloppy, typical of arrogant people who truly believe they will never be caught or questioned by their own children. My dad used about $400,000 to pay off his logistics company's massive commercial debts and keep himself out of bankruptcy. But the rest of my money, my stolen inheritance, was funneled through a series of smaller wire transfers into a joint checking account. I checked the registered names on that joint account. It belonged to Amanda and Derek. My parents had stolen my inheritance to save their own skin and then used the remainder to quietly purchase Amanda and Derek's first starter home in pure cash. Derek, who constantly talked down to me and told me to call an Uber in the rain, had been living in a house funded entirely by my stolen trust fund. They had built their entire comfortable, luxurious lives on the money my grandfather left for me. And now, because Amanda wanted a bigger, newer mansion in a gated community, they were trying to extort me for another $500,000 using a forged document. A cold, dangerous calm washed over me. The hurt and betrayal I felt at the steakhouse completely vanished, replaced by a hyper-focused clinical rage. This was no longer just about a stolen Audi or a ruined birthday dinner. This was a decade-long criminal conspiracy involving federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. I checked my watch. It was 2 in the afternoon. I needed to secure my immediate physical assets before I dropped the hammer on their financial lives. I grabbed my phone and opened the GPS tracking application for my stolen Audi. I had installed a hidden secondary tracker under the dashboard 2 years ago after a string of high-profile car thefts in my neighborhood. My dad had the paper title, but I had the data. The application showed a blinking blue dot moving steadily across the city. I watched it travel down the interstate before finally coming to a complete stop in the most affluent, expensive retail district in town. I zoomed in on the satellite map. The car was parked in the customer lot of an exclusive luxury auto dealership. Amanda was not just driving my car around town, she was actively trying to trade it in to upgrade her lifestyle on my dime. I grabbed my coat, slipped on a pair of comfortable shoes, and picked up my keys. The terrified daughter act was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive, and I was going to start by publicly ruining her afternoon. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The signature was mine. There was no denying the sharp angle of the L or the looping curve of the N. For a fleeting second, a wave of intense self-doubt washed over me. Had my parents slipped this piece of paper into a stack of college loan applications when I was an overwhelmed teenager? Had I blindly signed away my financial freedom because I trusted the people who raised me? But the panic only lasted for a moment. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let my professional instincts take over. I am a forensic accountant. I spend 60 hours a week dismantling corporate lies, tracing hidden offshore accounts, and proving that numbers do not lie even when people do. I opened my eyes and looked at the PDF document, not as a terrified daughter, but as an investigator. My grandfather Theodore used to tell me that a lie is like a cheap suit. From far away it looks perfect, but if you inspect the seams, it always falls apart. I decided to inspect the seams of my parents' master plan. I saved the attachment to my secure hard drive and opened it using my specialized forensic imaging software. This program is designed to strip away the visual layer of a digital document and expose the raw data and metadata buried underneath. Fraudsters usually focus on making the front of a document look convincing completely, forgetting that computers record every single keystroke modification and save state. I pulled up the metadata properties for the promissory note. The lawyer claimed this was a scanned copy of an original physical document signed 17 years ago. If that were true, the document properties would simply show today as the creation date for the scan. But my parents had been sloppy. The file they sent the lawyer was not a scan of a physical piece of paper. It was a digital PDF that had been converted directly from a Microsoft Word document. And the creation date of that original Word document was not 17 years ago. It was exactly 4 days ago. They had created the text of the contract this week, digitally copy and pasted a high-resolution image of my signature from some other old document, and flattened the file to make it look like a seamless scanned page. It was a digital forgery, but I knew that proving a digital creation date might not be enough to satisfy a judge or completely destroy their lawyer in a mediation room. They could always lie and claim they retyped an old physical contract for clarity. I needed undeniable physical proof that the words on this page could not possibly have existed 17 years ago. I switched back to the visual view of the document and magnified the image to 400%. The text filled my entire screen. I analyzed the typography. I looked at the kerning, which is the spacing between the individual letters. I looked at the specific weight and curve of the vowels. When you investigate financial records for a living, you learn to pay attention to the fonts people use on receipts and invoices. This contract was not typed in Times New Roman. It was not typed in Arial or Courier. The letters were sleek modern and completely devoid of the small decorative strokes known as serifs. I recognized the typeface immediately. It was Calibri Light. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. My parents were incredibly arrogant, but they were also incredibly stupid. I opened a new browser window and pulled up the official Microsoft Typography Release History archives. I cross-referenced the date printed at the very top of their forged promissory note. The date on the contract was from 17 years ago, right around the time I graduated high school. But according to the official software archives, the font Calibri Light was not introduced to the public until 2012 as part of the Windows 8 operating system launch. That was years after I had allegedly signed this piece of paper. It was a time-traveling font. It was an absolute, undisputed anachronism. There was no alternate explanation, no clever legal loophole they could use to explain this away. My parents had used a modern computer to draft a fake contract, backdated it by nearly 2 decades, and attached my stolen signature to it. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins now. I was no longer just looking at a fake bill. I was looking at a felony. I turned my attention to the bottom right corner of the document. Next to my forged signature was a round official-looking notary public stamp. In the state of Illinois, a contract of this magnitude requires a registered notary to verify the identities of the signing parties. The stamp had a name, a commission number, and an expiration date. If my parents had gone through the trouble of forging the document, how did they get a notary to stamp it? I logged into the State Department database for commissioned notaries. I typed in the long string of numbers from the stamp on the PDF. The search results loaded instantly. The commission number belonged to a man named Richard Vance, but the details on his profile provided the final devastating nail in the coffin. Richard Vance had received his notary license exactly 5 years ago. He was not even a commissioned notary when I was 18 years old. There was zero possibility he could have legally witnessed and stamped a document 17 years ago. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my home office. The sheer scale of their stupidity was breathtaking. By emailing this forged document to an attorney and having that attorney email it to me across state lines to demand $500,000, my father and mother had just committed federal wire fraud, attempted extortion, and forgery. They thought they were dealing with the quiet, compliant scapegoat they used to lock in her room whenever Amanda threw a tantrum. They thought they could bully me into liquidating my savings to buy my sister a luxury house. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded gun to a professional auditor. I poured my cold coffee down the sink and walked over to the window. The morning sun was shining brightly on the wet pavement outside. I did not feel sad anymore. The lingering hurt of being abandoned in the rain on my birthday was completely gone. In its place was a cold, calculating determination. I knew exactly what I had to do next. If I called their lawyer right now and pointed out the font anomaly and the fake notary, they would panic, withdraw the demand, and try to find another way to ruin me. I could not let them do that. I needed them to commit to this lie. I needed them to put this fake document on the official court record. Once they filed a formal lawsuit based on forged evidence, there would be no going back. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. I needed to play the victim one last time. I needed to convince them that their master plan was working flawlessly so they would feel comfortable enough to proceed. I opened my email and hit reply to the attorney. But instead of threatening him or exposing the forgery, I typed a very short, very desperate-sounding message. I wrote that I was completely overwhelmed by the amount of money they were demanding. I wrote that I needed a few days to consult with a financial advisor to see if I could secure a personal loan to cover the first installment. I ended the email by begging them not to file the lawsuit just yet. I hit send. It was the perfect bait. It made me look weak, cooperative, and terrified of going to court. I knew my mother would read that email and smile, thinking she had successfully broken my spirit. But the truth was, I was just buying time. I had exactly 72 hours until their deadline expired. 72 hours to wait for David, my private investigator, to deliver the full financial background check on my father and Derek. I had already broken their fake contract. Now I was going to tear apart their real bank accounts. The true power of a forensic accountant does not just lie in knowing how to read complex spreadsheets or track hidden offshore accounts. It lies in understanding human psychology. People who commit financial crimes are inherently arrogant. They believe they are the smartest people in the room, and they rely entirely on the intimidation of their victims to keep their secrets buried. My parents were no different. They had just committed federal wire fraud by sending me a forged legal document across state lines. But they were banking on the fact that I was still the terrified, compliant little girl they used to lock in her bedroom whenever my sister threw a tantrum. I knew that if I confronted them right now with the evidence of the time-traveling font and the fake notary stamp, they would immediately panic. They would fire their cheap attorney, withdraw the demand letter, and scramble to cover their tracks. I could not let that happen. I needed them to put this fake contract on the official court record. I needed them to firmly lock themselves into their own trap. To do that, I had to give them the exact reaction they were expecting. I had to play dumb. I picked up my phone, took a deep breath, and dialed my mother. I had blocked her number the night before, but I unblocked it just for this performance. As the phone began to ring, I forced my chest to heave. I made my breathing sound shallow and erratic. I pinched the bridge of my nose to make my voice sound thick and congested, exactly like someone who had been crying all morning. Susan answered on the third ring. Her voice was sharp, clipped, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She simply said my name, waiting for me to speak first. "Mom, please," I stammered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the second syllable. "I just got the email from Dad's lawyer. I am terrified. Please do not sue me." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. I knew she was sitting at her pristine kitchen island, probably sipping an expensive espresso, feeling like an absolute genius. "Well, Lauren," she finally said, letting out a long, dramatic sigh. Actions have consequences. You chose to walk out on a family dinner. You chose to disrespect us in a public restaurant and refuse to acknowledge your financial obligations. What did you expect your father to do? We are not going to just let you walk away from your responsibilities anymore. I do not have $525,000 sitting in my checking account, I pleaded, pouring as much desperation into the phone as I could muster. Mom, you know I do not have that kind of liquid cash. If you take me to court, it will ruin my career. I could lose my license. Please. Susan clicked her tongue in a condescending rhythm. You should have thought about your career before you decided to be so ungrateful. Your sister Amanda is under an immense amount of stress right now. Derek is working incredibly hard, and they need to secure the down payment for their new house by the end of the month. We sacrificed our best years raising you. Your father went into massive debt to keep a roof over your head when you were a teenager. It is only fair that you return the favor now that you are successful. I squeezed my eyes shut, not out of sadness, but to stop myself from laughing out loud at the sheer audacity of her lies. I begged her again. I asked her for just a little bit of time. I told her I needed a few days to speak with a financial advisor to see if I could secure a massive personal loan against my retirement accounts to cover the first payment. I heard a muffled voice in the background. It was my father. Susan covered the receiver for a brief moment, whispering something to him before returning to the call. We are not monsters, Lauren, she said, her tone dripping with fake magnanimity. We are your family, and we want to handle this privately. Your father is willing to give you until Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. If we do not have a signed payment agreement and an initial wire transfer, by then the lawsuit moves forward and we will see you in front of a judge. Do not test us. I thanked her profusely, my voice practically shaking with manufactured relief. I promised I would have everything figured out by Friday. As soon as she disconnected the call, the terrified daughter act vanished instantly. I dropped the phone onto my desk, my face completely neutral. My heart rate was perfectly steady. I had just bought myself exactly 3 days of uninterrupted silence, 72 hours to tear their financial history apart piece by piece. I turned my attention away from the forged promissory note and focused entirely on the absurd itemized invoice my father had handed me at the steakhouse. I spread the stapled pages across my desk. I needed to understand why he chose that specific number. $525,000 is a highly specific amount for an extortion attempt. When people commit fraud, the numbers they invent are rarely random. They usually correlate directly to a specific hidden debt they need to cover or a specific purchase they are trying to make. I opened a new browser window and pulled up the real estate listings for the affluent gated community, where Amanda and Derek were desperately trying to buy their new house. It only took me 5 minutes to find the exact property. It was a massive 5-bedroom modern farmhouse with a heated pool and a 3-car garage. The listing price was $2.6 million. In today's competitive housing market, a standard 20% down payment on a house that expensive would be exactly $520,000. Throw in $5,000 for closing costs, and you hit their magical number. They were literally trying to force me to buy my sister a mansion. But as I looked closer at the itemized breakdown of my childhood expenses on my father's invoice, a glaring inconsistency caught my trained eye. The invoice was divided by years. According to his calculations, the most severe financial hardship my parents faced occurred during a very specific 4-year window. It was the exact 4 years I was away at state college. On the invoice, my father claimed he had to take out massive high-interest personal loans and completely drain his logistics company's operating budget just to keep the family afloat during those 4 years because of the financial burden I had placed on them. He had even included fake interest calculations on those supposed loans. This made absolutely no sense. I paid for my own college tuition using federal student loans and academic scholarships. I paid for my own off-campus apartment by working double shifts as a waitress at a diner near the university. My parents never sent me a single dollar for groceries, textbooks, or rent. So why did my father's business supposedly face financial ruin during those specific years? Just as I was circling those dates with a red pen, my secure email client chimed with a high-priority notification. It was from David, our firm's private investigator. The subject line simply read, "Initial Financial Asset Report." I downloaded the encrypted file and opened it. David was worth every single penny I paid him. He had managed to pull a comprehensive history of my father's business and personal bank accounts, property deeds, and tax filings going back over 15 years. I immediately filtered the spreadsheet data to isolate the 4-year window from my father's fake invoice. I aligned the timeline of my dad's supposed financial ruin with his actual verified bank records. I scanned the columns of credits and debits looking for the massive loans he claimed he took out. Instead, my hands froze over the keyboard. There were no high-interest personal loans. There was no drained operating budget. Right in the middle of my junior year of college during the exact same month, my father claimed he was drowning in debt because of me. His business bank account showed a massive, completely unexplained cash deposit. It was a direct wire transfer for exactly $1.5 million. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I read the origin routing numbers of the wire transfer. The money did not come from a bank loan. It did not come from a corporate investor. It came from a highly secure escrow account managed by a private wealth management law firm located in Boston. I ran a quick background search on the name of the law firm attached to the routing number. The search results loaded instantly, and the breath completely caught in my throat. It was the exact law firm that had handled the estate planning and execution for my late grandfather. My grandfather had passed away when I was 19 years old. At his funeral, my parents had looked me in the eye and told me his entire estate was tied up in commercial debt, leaving absolutely nothing behind for the family. I had never questioned them. But looking at the $1.5 million transfer sitting in my father's account, I realized that my entire life, my years of struggling and paying my own way, had been built on a staggering multi-million-dollar lie. I sat perfectly still in the quiet of my home office, the blue light from the computer monitor reflecting off my face. The $1.5 million wire transfer glowed on the screen like a neon sign in the dark. For a moment the room seemed to spin. My grandfather Theodore had been my hero. He was a self-made real estate developer who always encouraged my independence. At his funeral, my parents looked me directly in the eye and swore that his entire estate was swallowed up by commercial debt. They told me he died with nothing to his name. I had mourned his loss and never once questioned their story. I had spent my entire 20s eating cheap noodles, working exhausting double shifts at an accounting firm, and panicking over my student loan payments, completely unaware that I was the rightful owner of $750,000. But as the initial shock faded, the forensic accountant in me took over. Money of that magnitude does not just move on its own. My grandfather was a meticulous businessman. If he left behind a trust, it would have been heavily protected. I knew that an irrevocable trust requires the explicit notarized consent of the beneficiaries to authorize an early disbursement or a transfer of funds. The money was meant for Amanda and me. There was absolutely no legal way the private wealth management firm in Boston would have wired $1.5 million directly into my father's failing business account unless they received a signed release form from both of us. I immediately logged into the state probate court digital archives. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I paid the expedited search fees and pulled the original trust documents from my grandfather's estate. The heavy digital files loaded slowly, revealing hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon. I bypassed the standard provisions and went straight for the disbursement schedule and the final execution documents. There it was. A formal legal release document dated exactly 10 years ago. It was a formal authorization instructing the trust manager to liquidate the assets and wire the full $1.5 million directly into the operating account of my father's logistics company. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page to look at the signatures. On the bottom left was Amanda's signature, and on the bottom right, resting perfectly on the black line, was mine. I stared at the blue ink on the glowing screen. It was the exact same flawless, perfectly copied signature my parents had just used on the fake promissory note that morning. My parents had not just stolen my Audi. 10 years ago, they had forged my name on a federal financial document and stolen $750,000 that legally belonged to me. A cold, dangerous calm washed over me. The hurt and betrayal I felt at the steakhouse completely vanished, replaced by a hyper-focused clinical rage. This was no longer just about a stolen car or a ruined birthday dinner. This was a decade-long criminal conspiracy. I needed to know exactly where my stolen inheritance went after it hit my father's business account. I dug deeper into the investigative report provided by David, my private investigator. When you track hidden assets for a living, you learn that criminals always leave a paper trail, no matter how hard they try to cover it up. My father's paper trail was incredibly sloppy. I traced the flow of the funds week by week. My dad used about $400,000 of my money to pay off his logistics company's massive commercial debts and keep himself out of bankruptcy. He used another chunk to fund his and my mother's lavish lifestyle, paying off country club fees and credit cards. But the most sickening discovery came when I tracked the remaining $350,000. The money was not kept in my father's account. It was funneled through a series of smaller structured wire transfers into a newly formed limited liability company. I pulled the state registration records for the LLC. The registered agent and sole owner of the shell company was Derek, my arrogant, condescending brother-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, my mind piecing the entire puzzle together. 10 years ago, Amanda and Derek were newlyweds looking for a house. They had no savings and terrible credit. My parents stole my inheritance, laundered it through Derek's fake LLC to avoid federal gift taxes, and used it to quietly purchase Amanda and Derek's first starter home entirely in pure cash. Derek, the man who constantly talked down to me, the man who laughed in my face at the steakhouse and told me to call an Uber in the freezing rain, had been living in a house funded entirely by my stolen trust fund. They had built their entire comfortable, luxurious lives on the money my grandfather left for me. And now, because Amanda wanted a bigger, newer mansion in a gated community, they were trying to extort me for another $500,000 using a forged document. The sheer level of greed was breathtaking. I closed the spreadsheets and locked my computer screen. The financial audit was yielding massive results, but I could not sit in this office anymore. I needed to secure my immediate physical assets before I dropped the legal hammer on their entire existence. I needed to get my car back. My father might have gone to the Department of Motor Vehicles and maliciously signed the paper title over to Amanda, but he did not know about the technology inside the vehicle. After a string of high-profile car thefts in my neighborhood 2 years ago, I had a specialized mechanic install a hidden secondary GPS tracking device deep under the dashboard of the Audi. It was completely separate from the factory navigation system, and it synced directly to a private application on my smartphone. I pulled out my phone and opened the application. A detailed satellite map of the city filled the screen. A blinking blue dot represented my stolen vehicle. I watched the screen closely. The dot was not parked at Amanda's house. It was moving steadily across the interstate, heading toward the wealthiest retail and commercial district in the city. I watched the dot take an exit and travel down a major boulevard lined with high-end boutiques and luxury car dealerships. Finally, the blue dot came to a complete stop. I zoomed in on the map until I could read the name of the business where the car was parked. It was an exclusive high-end imported auto dealership known for selling custom luxury vehicles. My blood ran cold and then began to boil. Amanda was not just taking my car for a joyride to run errands. She was actively trying to trade it in. She wanted to use the pristine Audi I had paid for with my own hard-earned money, using the equity I built through years of $600 monthly payments to finance a brand new luxury vehicle for herself. She thought because she held a piece of paper from my father, the car was hers to sell. She was about to find out how wrong she was. I did not waste another second. I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick leather binder containing all the original physical maintenance logs, service receipts, and the true mileage records for the Audi. I shoved the binder into my tote bag. I walked into the hallway, slipped on a pair of sharp professional heels, and grabbed my coat. The terrified, compliant daughter they thought they were dealing with was officially dead. I was not going to hide in my house and cry over their betrayal. I called a rideshare and typed in the address of the luxury dealership. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time to walk right into their perfect afternoon and begin the systematic destruction of their lives. I sat completely frozen in my desk chair, the glowing digits of the $1.5 million wire transfer burning themselves into my memory. The silence of my townhouse was deafening. For a long moment, the room seemed to spin. My grandfather Harrison had been the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. He was a self-made man who built a highly successful regional hardware empire from a single dusty storefront. He was sharp, frugal, and deeply pragmatic. He always praised my analytical mind, often telling me that I was the only one in the family who understood the value of a hard-earned dollar. When he passed away during my freshman year of college, my entire world shattered. I had rushed home for the funeral, devastated and seeking comfort. Instead of grieving together, my parents pulled me into the kitchen after the service. My father, Thomas, looked me directly in the eye, his face a mask of solemn regret, and told me that grandfather Harrison had made some terrible business decisions in his final years. He swore to me that the entire estate was completely swallowed up by commercial debt and back taxes. He told me there was absolutely nothing left, not even enough to cover the funeral expenses, which my father claimed he was graciously paying for out of his own pocket. I was 19 years old and drowning in grief. I had no reason to doubt my own parents. I mourned my grandfather and never once questioned their story. I packed my bags, went back to my state university, and continued to scrape by on my own. But looking at the screen now, 15 years later, the truth was staring me in the face in black and white. Grandfather Harrison did not die in debt. He had a private wealth management firm in Boston handling a massive fortune, and my father had received $1.5 million of it right in the middle of my junior year of college. The forensic accountant in me immediately took over, pushing the shock and heartbreak aside to make room for cold clinical logic. Money of that magnitude does not just move on its own. Wealth management firms do not randomly wire millions of dollars to a logistics company operating account unless they are legally forced to. I needed to see the original estate planning documents. I needed to know exactly what my grandfather had intended for that money before my father got his hands on it. I opened a new tab on my secure browser and navigated directly to the State Probate Court digital archives. Because I investigate corporate fraud for a living, I have premium access to public and sealed court records across multiple states. I bypassed the public search function and logged into the attorney portal. I typed in grandfather Harrison's full legal name, his date of birth, and his date of death. The system brought up his probate file immediately. It was locked behind a heavy digital seal, requiring a $75 expedited access fee. I typed in my credit card information without blinking. The system processed the payment, and a massive 400-page digital file began to download. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. When the PDF finally opened, I was greeted by pages upon pages of dense, highly technical legal jargon. I did not have time to read through his property deeds or his minor charitable donations. I used the document search function and typed my own name. The search yielded a direct hit on page 42. I scrolled down to Article 4, Section B. The bold heading read, "The Harrison Irrevocable Generation Skipping Trust." I read the paragraphs, carefully analyzing the legal structure my grandfather had built. It was a masterpiece of asset protection. He knew my father was terrible with money. He knew Thomas had a failing logistics company and a habit of making reckless financial decisions to fund my mother's country club lifestyle. To protect his wealth from my parents, Grandfather Harrison had bypassed them entirely. The text was unambiguous. He had placed exactly $1.5 million in liquid cash into a high-yield irrevocable growth trust. The designated beneficiaries were his two granddaughters, Amanda and Lauren. The instructions for the trust manager were explicitly clear. The funds were to be divided evenly: $750,000 for Amanda and $750,000 for me. But there was a crucial stipulation. Grandfather Harrison did not want us getting that kind of money when we were immature teenagers. The legal clause stated that the funds were to be held securely and actively managed until each beneficiary reached their 25th birthday. Upon turning 25, the trust would dissolve, and the money would be wired directly into our personal accounts to help us buy homes, start businesses, or secure our futures. I sat back in my chair, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs. $750,000. My mind instantly flashed back to the winter of my junior year of college, the exact same time period my father had received the wire transfer. I was 21 years old. I was living in a dilapidated, drafty off-campus apartment with 3 roommates because it was the only place I could afford. The heating system had broken down in January, and our landlord refused to fix it. I remembered sitting at my tiny desk wrapped in 2 blankets, my fingers numb from the cold, eating plain instant rice, while trying to study for my advanced taxation exams. I was working 30 hours a week as a waitress at a diner just to make rent and taking out maximum federal student loans to cover my tuition. I was completely exhausted, constantly stressed, and terrified of my financial future. I had called my mother that winter, practically begging for a $200 loan to buy textbooks for the semester. Susan had sighed heavily into the phone, lecturing me about financial responsibility, and told me that she and my dad were struggling too much to help me. While I was freezing in that apartment, starving and buried in student debt, my parents were sitting on my $750,000. A new dark wave of anger washed over me, hotter and more intense than anything I had felt at the restaurant. They had literally watched me suffer. They had watched me struggle to build my life from the ground up, knowing full well they had stolen the safety net my grandfather had specifically built for me. And yesterday they had the absolute sociopathic audacity to hand me an itemized invoice for $525,000, claiming they went into debt to raise me. They actually billed me for middle school math tutoring while hiding the fact that they had stolen my fortune. But the timeline still did not make sense. I was 21 during my junior year. Amanda was only 18. The trust was legally ironclad. The money was not supposed to be touched until we were 25. How in the world did Thomas convince a highly cautious Boston law firm to break an irrevocable trust and wire the entire $1.5 million directly into his corporate business account 4 years early? An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. It cannot be altered, broken, or drained by anyone, not even the creator, once it is finalized. The only legal mechanism to dissolve an irrevocable trust before the maturity date is a unanimous notarized consent decree signed by all named beneficiaries. The wealth management firm would never have released those funds unless they received a formal, legally binding document, proving that both Amanda and I explicitly agreed to terminate the trust and surrender the money to my father. I pulled my keyboard closer. The sadness and betrayal evaporated, leaving only the sharp, predatory instincts of a forensic auditor. I went back to the county clerk's digital portal. I closed the main estate planning document and opened the secondary file folder labeled Executed Releases and Discharges. There were dozens of scanned pages in the folder. I scrolled past the tax clearances and the property transfer deeds until I found a document dated mid-November of my junior year. The title of the document was Voluntary Termination of Trust and Release of Funds. I double-clicked the file. As the high-resolution scan loaded onto my screen, I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins. It was a formal legal authorization, heavily drafted by an attorney instructing the wealth management firm to immediately liquidate the $1.5 million trust. The document explicitly directed the firm to wire the entirety of the funds to the corporate operating account of my father's logistics company. I scrolled past the dense paragraphs of legal release language straight to the bottom of the final page where the execution signatures were located. There were two signature lines. On the left side, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was the signature of my sister Amanda, and on the right side, directly next to a stamped notary seal, was my signature. I stared at my own name in bright blue ink. It was an absolute flawless forgery. It was the exact same signature they had digitally copied and pasted onto the fake promissory note they sent me this morning. My parents had not just committed a minor fraud. 10 years ago, they had orchestrated a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime. They had forged my signature on a legal trust document, bypassed a Boston wealth management firm, and stolen my entire future to save themselves. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. I grabbed my heavy leather tote bag, ensuring the thick binder of my Audi service records was securely zipped inside, and walked out my front door. The rideshare I had ordered was already waiting at the curb. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver a polite nod. As we navigated the midday traffic toward the luxury retail district, I stared out the window, my mind processing the sheer scale of my family's betrayal. They had not just taken my car, they had stolen $750,000 of my rightful inheritance, laundered it through a fake shell company owned by Derek, and used it to buy the house where my sister currently slept every single night. And as if that staggering theft was not enough, they had the absolute sociopathic audacity to hand me a fake invoice for $525,000 to fund their next real estate upgrade. They had drained my past, and now they were trying to bankrupt my future. The rideshare pulled into the sprawling, immaculate parking lot of the high-end imported auto dealership. I stepped out of the vehicle and smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored coat. The dealership looked like a modern art museum. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows, polished white marble floors, and perfectly spaced luxury vehicles gleaming under the bright showroom lights. I scanned the visitor parking area and immediately spotted it. My white Audi Q5 was parked in the premier appraisal spot, right near the front entrance. I walked through the heavy glass doors, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The showroom was quiet, smelling of expensive leather and complimentary espresso. I did not have to search for them very long. Sitting at a sleek glass desk near the center of the room were Amanda and Derek. Amanda was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, sipping sparkling water from a tall crystal glass. She was pointing at a glossy brochure for a brand new fully loaded Porsche Macan. Derek was leaning back in his leather chair, his legs crossed arrogantly, speaking to a young, eager salesman in a tailored suit. Derek was talking loudly, clearly, trying to impress the salesman by bragging about his position at a mid-level marketing firm, acting as though he were a massive corporate executive. I walked up behind them silently. The salesman noticed me first. He offered a polite professional smile and asked if he could help me find something. Amanda froze. She slowly lowered her sparkling water and turned around. The smug, entitled expression she had worn at the steakhouse instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. Derek dropped his arrogant posture and sat straight up, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. "What are you doing here, Lauren?" Derek snapped, his voice low and defensive. "Are you stalking us now? Did you have to take an Uber to get here?" I ignored him completely. I looked directly at the young salesman, keeping my voice incredibly calm, pleasant, and strictly professional. I extended my hand and introduced myself. I told him that I was the primary driver and sole financier of the white Audi parked in his appraisal spot. The salesman looked incredibly confused. He glanced down at the paperwork on his desk, then back up at me. He politely explained that Thomas, my father, was listed as the legal owner on the title, and that he had legally transferred that title to Amanda just yesterday. The salesman stated that Amanda and Derek were currently using the vehicle as a high-equity trade-in to finance the down payment on the new Porsche. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. I told the salesman that I was fully aware of the title transfer. I explained that my father had indeed put his name on the paper title years ago for insurance purposes, but that I had paid every single monthly installment, every insurance premium, and every maintenance cost for the entire lifespan of the vehicle. Amanda scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and turning back to the salesman. "Do not listen to her," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "She is just my bitter older sister. She is having a financial crisis, and she is extremely jealous. We have the legal title. The car is ours to trade. Can we just finalize the paperwork, please?" The salesman looked uncomfortable, caught in the middle of a family dispute, but the promise of a massive commission from a Porsche sale kept him in his seat. He tapped his pen against the desk and tried to diffuse the tension. He told me that regardless of who paid the monthly notes, the legal title was what mattered for the dealership. He added that they were able to offer a premium trade in value because the Audi was in such pristine condition and had incredibly low mileage for its age. I raised an eyebrow. I asked him exactly how many miles Amanda had claimed were on the odometer. The salesman looked at his intake form. He proudly stated that the vehicle only had 42,000 miles on it, which made it an incredibly rare find for that specific model year. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Amanda immediately tensed her knuckles, turning white as she gripped her glass of sparkling water. Derek shifted nervously in his chair. 42,000 miles, I repeated, letting the number hang in the quiet air of the showroom. That is absolutely fascinating. I unzipped my heavy tote bag and pulled out the thick leather binder containing my meticulous vehicle records. I dropped the binder onto the center of the glass desk with a loud, authoritative thud. The salesman jumped slightly in his chair. I opened the binder and flipped to the very last page. I pulled out a perfectly preserved, officially stamped service receipt from the dealership's own certified mechanic. I slid the paper across the desk until it was resting right on top of Amanda's glossy Porsche brochure. Because when I took that exact car into the authorized service center for its routine transmission fluid change, exactly 14 days ago, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet showroom. The digital odometer was sitting at exactly 87,500 miles. The blood instantly drained from the salesman's face. He picked up the certified service receipt, his eyes darting between the stamped mileage on my paper and the intake form Amanda had filled out. I looked down at my sister. She was completely pale, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single word. Derek was staring at the desk, his jaw clenched tight. They had thought they were so incredibly clever. They knew the Audi had high mileage because I used it to commute to client audits across the state. In order to maximize the trade-in value and secure their luxury Porsche, they had paid someone to illegally hack the vehicle's computer system and roll back the digital odometer. In the state of Illinois, tampering with a vehicle odometer to defraud a dealership is a severe felony. The salesman did not say another word to Derek or Amanda. He stood up immediately, his face flushed with anger, and walked quickly across the showroom to the elevated glass office where the dealership general manager was sitting. "You cannot do this to us," Amanda hissed, standing up from her chair. Her voice was shaking with rage and humiliation. "We are your family. You are ruining my life over a stupid car." I looked at her, taking in her designer clothes and her expensive jewelry, all paid for by my stolen inheritance. "I am not ruining your life, Amanda," I replied calmly. "You forged a legal document to steal $750,000 from me 10 years ago. You stole my car yesterday, and you just committed a federal crime inside a luxury dealership today. I am simply providing the documentation." Derek stood up, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He pointed a finger directly in my face. "You are going to pay for this, Lauren. Your dad is going to file that lawsuit for the $525,000 on Monday morning. We are going to drag you through court, garnish your wages, and make sure you lose your accounting license. You are going to wish you never walked in here today." Before I could even respond to his pathetic threat, the general manager of the dealership marched over to our desk. He was a tall, imposing man with a completely unamused expression. He threw the intake paperwork onto the desk right next to my service receipt. He looked directly at Derek and told him that the trade-in offer was immediately revoked. He stated that the dealership had a zero-tolerance policy for odometer fraud, and that they were legally obligated to report the discrepancy to the State Department of Motor Vehicles. He pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy glass doors and ordered them to leave the property immediately before he called the police to have them escorted out. Amanda burst into tears, her signature manipulation tactic, but no one in the showroom was buying it. The general manager crossed his arms and waited. Derek grabbed his wife by the arm, his face burning with absolute humiliation, as several other wealthy customers turned to watch the commotion. They walked out of the sliding glass doors completely defeated, without a new Porsche and without the trade-in money they desperately needed. I followed them out into the parking lot, taking my time. They practically ran to my Audi, quickly unlocking the doors and climbing inside. Derek rolled down the window as he started the engine. He glared at me, his eyes filled with absolute venom. "We will see you in court, you ungrateful bitch," he spat. I stood on the pristine concrete of the dealership lot, the cool afternoon breeze rushing past me. I smiled, looking right into his panicked, angry eyes. "I am really looking forward to the discovery phase, Derek," I said quietly. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the Audi sped out of the parking lot, aggressively merging into traffic. I stood there alone, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of peace. Derek had just promised to drag me into court. He had just promised to let my father file a formal lawsuit against me. That was exactly what I wanted. By filing a formal, documented lawsuit for an imaginary debt, my father was going to legally open up his entire financial history to the court system. He was going to give my attorneys the legal authority to subpoena every single bank account, every tax return, and every corporate ledger attached to his name and Derek's fake shell company. They thought they were building a trap for me, but they had just handed me the keys to their own prison cell. The salesman, a young man with a perfectly crisp collar and a heavy gold watch, looked up from his computer monitor, startled by my sudden appearance. Amanda was holding a sample square of premium beige leather, her manicured finger hovering over a glossy brochure for a fully loaded Porsche Macan. Derek was leaning back in his chair with his legs crossed, projecting the unearned arrogance of a man who believed he had just outsmarted everyone in the room. When Amanda finally looked up and saw me standing there, she dropped the leather swatch. It hit the glass desk with a sharp smack. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed under the bright showroom lights. Derek immediately dropped his relaxed posture, his feet hitting the floor as he sat straight up. "Excuse me, can I help you?" the salesman asked, his professional smile faltering as he sensed the sudden heavy tension radiating from my sister and her husband. "Actually, you can," I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated and entirely pleasant. "My name is Lauren. I am the primary driver and the sole financier of the white Audi Q5 that is currently sitting out front in your vehicle appraisal bay." Amanda quickly recovered from her shock, her face flushing with a deep, angry red. She turned to the salesman and let out a loud, condescending sigh. "Please ignore her," she said, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "She is my older sister. She is going through a very severe financial and mental crisis right now. She is just incredibly jealous that we are upgrading our vehicle." Derek stood up, using his height to try and physically intimidate me. He pointed a finger toward the front doors. "You need to turn around and walk out of here right now, Lauren," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "You are embarrassing yourself. Do not make me call dealership security to have you dragged out into the parking lot." I did not take a single step back. I looked right past Derek and focused entirely on the salesman. "I understand my sister's name is currently on the paper title you have sitting on your desk," I explained calmly. My father legally transferred that title to her yesterday morning. I foolishly allowed the vehicle to remain in his name when I purchased it in my early 20s to secure a multi-car insurance discount, but I can assure you I have paid every single monthly installment, every insurance premium, and every maintenance cost for the entire lifespan of that car directly from my own checking account. The salesman looked incredibly uncomfortable. He was caught in the middle of a volatile family dispute, but the promise of a massive commission from a luxury Porsche sale kept him glued to his seat. He tapped his expensive pen against the glass desk, clearly trying to find a diplomatic way to get rid of me. "Mom, I understand this is a frustrating personal situation," the salesman said, trying to use a soothing customer service voice. "But strictly from a dealership perspective, the legal title is the only document that dictates ownership. If your sister's name is on the state-issued title, she has the legal right to trade the vehicle in. They are getting a premium trade in value today because the Audi is in such pristine condition." I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Derek shift nervously on his feet. "A premium trade in value," I repeated, letting the words hang in the quiet air of the showroom. "That is absolutely fascinating. I am just curious, what kind of mileage did my sister claim was on the odometer when she filled out your intake paperwork?" Amanda tensed so hard her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the glass desk. Derek opened his mouth to tell the salesman not to answer me, but the young man had already glanced down at his intake sheet. "The vehicle only has 42,000 miles on it," the salesman stated proudly, "which makes it an incredibly rare find for that specific model year. It significantly boosts the equity they can apply to their new down payment." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed across the quiet showroom floor. Amanda actually squeezed her eyes shut, knowing exactly what was coming next. Derek clenched his jaw, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. They had thought they were so incredibly clever. They knew my Audi had high mileage because I used it constantly to commute to corporate audits and client meetings across the entire state. In order to maximize the cash value of the stolen car and secure their brand new Porsche, they had paid a shady mechanic to illegally hack the vehicle's computer system and roll back the digital odometer. 42,000 miles is quite the miracle," I said, unzipping my heavy leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, meticulously organized binder containing my vehicle records. I dropped the heavy binder right onto the center of the glass desk. The salesman jumped slightly in his chair. I opened the binder and flipped directly to the very last page. I pulled out a perfectly preserved, officially stamped service receipt from the dealership's own certified mechanic. I slid the paper across the glass until it was resting right on top of Amanda's glossy Porsche brochure. Because when I took that exact car into the authorized service center for its routine transmission fluid change, exactly 14 days ago, I said, my voice projecting clearly so the other customers browsing nearby could hear me. The digital odometer was sitting at exactly 87,500 miles. The blood instantly drained from the salesman's face. He picked up my certified service receipt with shaking hands. His eyes darted frantically between the officially stamped mileage on my paper and the fraudulent intake form Amanda had personally signed just 20 minutes earlier. In the state of Illinois, tampering with a vehicle odometer to defraud a registered dealership is not a minor misunderstanding. It is a severe felony. The salesman did not say another word to Derek or Amanda. He dropped the receipt on the desk, stood up immediately, and walked briskly across the showroom floor toward the elevated glass office where the dealership general manager was sitting. "You cannot do this to us," Amanda hissed, standing up from her chair. Her voice was trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute humiliation. "We are your family. You are ruining my life over a stupid car. You know we need the trade in equity for our new house." I looked at her, taking in her designer sunglasses, her expensive handbag, and her perfect hair, all funded by my stolen trust fund. "I am not ruining your life, Amanda," I replied, keeping my tone deadly flat. "You forged a legal document to steal $750,000 from me 10 years ago. You stole my car yesterday. And you just committed a federal crime inside a luxury dealership today." I am simply providing the correct documentation. Derek stepped closer, his face burning with a furious, ugly red. You are going to pay for this, Lauren, he spat, pointing a finger directly at my face. Your dad is going to file that lawsuit for the $525,000 on Monday morning. We are going to drag you through the mud, garnish your wages, and make sure you lose your accounting license. You are going to wish you never walked in here today. Before I could even respond to his pathetic, empty threat, the general manager of the dealership marched over to our desk. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and a completely unamused expression. He snatched the intake paperwork off the desk, crumpled it in his fist, and threw it into the nearby trash can. He looked directly at Derek. The trade-in offer is immediately revoked, the general manager said, his voice hard and uncompromising. We have a zero-tolerance policy for odometer fraud at this establishment, and we are legally obligated to report this discrepancy to the State Department of Motor Vehicles. I suggest you take your keys and leave this property immediately before I call the local police to have you escorted out in handcuffs. Amanda burst into tears. It was her signature manipulation tactic, the exact same crying routine she used on our parents whenever she was caught doing something wrong. But no one in the showroom was buying it. The wealthy customers browsing the floor were actively staring at them, whispering to one another. The general manager crossed his arms over his chest and waited completely unmoved by her fake sobbing. Derek grabbed his wife by the arm, his face twisted in absolute disgrace. They turned around and walked out of the heavy sliding glass doors completely defeated, leaving without a new Porsche and without the massive cash equity they desperately needed to keep their fake lifestyle afloat. I took my time following them out into the parking lot. The cool afternoon breeze felt incredible against my skin. They practically ran to my Audi, quickly unlocking the doors and scrambling inside like terrified rats. Derek rolled down the driver's side window as he started the engine. He glared at me across the pristine concrete, his eyes filled with absolute venom. "We will see you in court, you ungrateful bitch!" he yelled over the sound of the engine. I stood there with my tote bag on my shoulder and smiled. It was a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I looked right into his panicked eyes. "I am really looking forward to the discovery phase, Derek," I said quietly. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The Audi tires screeched against the pavement as he sped out of the parking lot, aggressively cutting into the heavy afternoon traffic. I watched the taillights disappear down the boulevard, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. Derek had just promised to drag me into court. He had just promised to let my father file a formal lawsuit against me for their fake invoice. That was exactly the trap I had been waiting for them to walk into. By filing a formal, documented lawsuit for an imaginary debt, my father was going to legally open up his entire financial history to the civil court system. He was going to give my attorneys the absolute legal authority to subpoena every single bank account, every tax return, and every corporate ledger attached to his name and Derek's fake shell company. They thought they were building a trap to destroy me, but they had just handed me the keys to their own prison cell. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. It was time to pull the trigger. The phone rang twice before she answered. Her name was Rebecca Thorne, and she was widely known throughout the city as a complete shark. I had worked across the table from her on several massive corporate embezzlement cases, and I knew she took absolutely no prisoners. I stood in the parking lot of the luxury dealership, the cool wind whipping through my hair, and gave her a rapid clinical overview of my situation. I told her my parents had stolen my inheritance, laundered the funds through a shell company owned by my brother-in-law, and were now attempting to extort me for $500,000 using a forged document. Rebecca did not gasp or offer any fake sympathy. She simply asked for my retainer fee and told me to be at her downtown office at 8:00 sharp on Monday morning. The weekend was entirely silent. Amanda and Derek had undoubtedly run straight to my parents to cry about the humiliating incident at the dealership. I knew they were sitting in my parents' living room spinning a web of lies, claiming I had acted like a lunatic and ruined their dream of owning a new Porsche. But the silence from them was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet right before a hurricane. I did not waste my weekend resting. I spent Saturday and Sunday compiling every single piece of evidence into a massive, meticulously organized digital file. On Monday morning, I sat in the sleek glass-walled conference room of Rebecca Thorne on the 40th floor of her downtown high-rise. We were drinking black coffee when her paralegal walked in and handed her a thick manila folder. Rebecca opened the folder, scanned the first page, and a sharp, predatory smile spread across her face. She looked across the table at me and announced that my father had just officially filed the civil lawsuit against me in county court. He was officially suing me for breach of contract, demanding the $525,000 plus all of his legal fees. By formally filing that paperwork, my father had committed himself to his own destruction. He had officially entered a forged document into the public record. But more importantly, he had triggered the legal phase of civil discovery. When you sue someone in civil court over financial damages, you give the defendant the absolute legal right to inspect your financial history to verify your claims. My father thought he was intimidating me. He thought the sheer terror of a lawsuit would force me to drain my savings and write him a check. He had absolutely no idea that he had just legally authorized me to pry open every single locked door in his life. I handed my secure flash drive to Rebecca. I told her I had already done the heavy lifting over the weekend. We pulled up the forged promissory note on the massive conference room monitor. I walked her through the digital metadata highlighting the creation date from last week. I pointed out the Calibri Light time traveling font, explaining that the typography did not even exist when I was 18 years old. Then I pulled up the state database and showed her that the notary public who stamped the contract was not even commissioned until 5 years ago. Rebecca actually laughed out loud. She shook her head and said it was the sloppiest, most arrogant forgery she had seen in 20 years of practicing corporate law. But then I opened the financial spreadsheet provided by my private investigator. I showed her the $1.5 million wire transfer from my grandfather's trust fund. I showed her the forged release document with my fake signature. I mapped out the paper trail showing exactly how my father funneled $350,000 into the limited liability company owned by Derek. Rebecca stopped laughing. The mood in the conference room shifted from professional amusement to absolute razor-sharp severity. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. She told me this was no longer just a civil dispute over a fake invoice. This was a massive criminal conspiracy involving federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. She looked me dead in the eye and asked me what my ultimate goal was. Did I want to send my family to federal prison immediately, or did I want my money back? I did not even have to think about my answer. I told her I wanted to strip them of every single asset they had acquired with my money. I wanted to take back the house, the cars, and the country club memberships. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror, coldness, and helplessness I felt when I was freezing in my drafty college apartment, starving while they lived in luxury. Rebecca nodded slowly. She opened her laptop and began to type. We did not just draft a standard legal response to deny the debt. We filed a massive counterclaim for fraud, theft, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But the real weapon was our discovery requests. We drafted emergency aggressive subpoenas demanding every single bank statement, tax return, wire transfer log, and corporate ledger tied to my father, my mother, and Derek, going back exactly 10 years. We subpoenaed the closing documents and the mortgage history for Amanda's current house. We officially demanded that my father produce the original physical copy of the promissory note for forensic ink testing, knowing full well he only had a digital file. By Tuesday afternoon, the process servers were dispatched across the city. My father was served his stack of subpoenas right in the middle of his logistics warehouse, surrounded by his own employees. Derek was served at his open plan marketing office, handed a thick legal envelope while he was trying to run a team meeting. My mother was served while sitting on the sunny patio of her exclusive country club, completely humiliating her in front of her wealthy socialite friends. They had expected me to cower in fear and beg for a settlement. Instead, I had just dropped a legal nuclear bomb on their entire fake existence. But the arrogance of people who have gotten away with lies their entire lives does not break immediately. They always assume they can manipulate their way out of any consequence. On Wednesday morning, my phone lit up with a voicemail from my mother. I hit play and listened to it on speakerphone while sitting at my home office desk. Her voice was not shaking with fear. It was dripping with absolute furious venom. "Lauren, you are making a massive mistake," Susan spat into the receiver. "Dragging your own family into court and sending process servers to my club over a simple financial disagreement is absolutely disgusting. You are acting like a petulant, ungrateful child. Our attorney is going to have your ridiculous subpoenas thrown out by the judge on Friday. You need to call off your attack dog lawyer right now. Drive over to this house and apologize to your father before he decides to truly ruin you." I listened to the message end and deleted it with a single tap of my finger. I did not reply. I did not explain myself. I let her sit in her beautiful house drinking her expensive coffee, truly believing she was still in control of the situation. My parents had hired a cheap discount attorney from a strip mall to draft their fake demand letter, assuming it would be enough to scare me. They had absolutely no idea they were now going up against a top-tier corporate litigator who specialized in destroying multi-million-dollar companies. They thought they could simply ask a judge to ignore the subpoenas. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their lawyer was about to review our evidence and realize his own clients had used him to commit federal fraud. The trap was completely set. The doors were locked, and there was absolutely no way out for them. The mandatory mediation session was scheduled for the following week, and I was going to walk into that room and dismantle my family piece by piece. By Friday morning, the sheer volume of paper arriving at the downtown law offices of Rebecca Thorne was absolutely staggering. My father and his discount strip mall attorney had spent the last 48 hours in a state of absolute legal panic. They had frantically filed an emergency motion with the county judge, begging the court to quash our subpoenas. Their lawyer argued that demanding a decade of financial records was an invasive overreach for a simple breach of contract lawsuit. But Rebecca was a master of the courtroom. She stood before the judge and calmly presented the forged promissory note, highlighting the time-traveling font and the fake notary stamp. She hinted strongly at underlying financial fraud. The judge took one look at the evidence, threw out my father's motion in less than 10 minutes, and ordered immediate full compliance under threat of criminal contempt. They had no choice. By Friday afternoon, a courier delivered 4 heavy cardboard boxes of physical financial ledgers and 2 encrypted hard drives containing their entire financial history. This was the exact trap I had laid for them, and they had walked right into it, locking the door behind themselves. I spent the entire weekend locked in Rebecca's secondary conference room, while my family was likely sitting in their beautiful homes, sweating in terror and wondering how much I was going to find. I was entirely in my element. For a forensic accountant, a box of disorganized financial records is not a chore. It is a crime scene waiting to be processed. I ordered black coffee, rolled up my sleeves, and began the systematic dissection of my family's lies. I started with my father's logistics company. The ledgers were an absolute disaster, painting a pathetic picture of a man who was desperate to project an image of wealth while his business completely bled out. He was constantly shifting money between operating accounts and personal credit cards to keep the lights on. But I did not care about his poor business skills. I was laser-focused on the $1.5 million wire transfer from my grandfather's trust. I tracked the exact path of the money. I found the initial deposit slip. I found the bank records showing my father withdrawing $400,000 to pay off his commercial creditors. I found the credit card statements proving he used another large chunk to pay for my mother's luxury vacations and her exorbitant country club fees. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle was Derek. I pulled the subpoenaed bank statements and tax filings for the limited liability company Derek had registered 10 years ago. He had named it Apex Consulting Services. According to his official corporate filings, it was a marketing consultancy firm. But as I combed through the bank records, I realized it was nothing more than a ghost company. There were no actual clients. There were no legitimate marketing expenses. There were no payroll records. The only significant financial activity the company ever recorded was a series of massive structured wire transfers coming directly from my father's logistics account. My father had funneled exactly $350,000 of my stolen inheritance into Derek's fake company. I opened Derek's personal and corporate federal tax returns from that specific year. When you transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars to a family member, the Internal Revenue Service requires you to pay a substantial gift tax. My father was too greedy to pay the government, and Derek was too arrogant to do things legally. Instead of claiming the money as a family gift, Derek had classified the massive transfer as legitimate business revenue for his fake consulting firm. But he did not stop there. To avoid paying income taxes on that massive sum of fake revenue, Derek had fabricated hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake business expenses. He wrote off luxury car leases, expensive dinners, and international vacations as corporate operating costs, effectively washing the money clean. He then withdrew the laundered cash and used it as the pure cash down payment for the massive starter home he and Amanda purchased. I sat back in the leather conference chair, staring at the tax returns. Derek was not just a smug, arrogant bully who married my spoiled sister. He was a white-collar criminal. He had actively engaged in federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering to hide my stolen inheritance, and he had documented all of it on federal tax forms and submitted them to the United States government. The penalty for this specific type of corporate tax fraud was severe, often carrying a mandatory sentence of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. I compiled every single bank statement, every fake expense report, and every tax return into a master file. I cross-referenced everything, printed the documents on thick, high-quality paper, and loaded them into a massive 3-inch thick legal binder. This binder was no longer just a defense against a fake lawsuit. It was an absolute death warrant for their freedom. On Sunday evening, the sky opened up, pouring heavy rain across the city. It was incredibly fitting. I was sitting in my quiet living room reviewing my notes for the mandatory mediation session scheduled for the next morning when the doorbell rang. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch, soaked from the rain and shivering in the cold, was Amanda. She was not wearing designer sunglasses. She was not holding a glass of sparkling water. She looked completely disheveled, her perfect blonde hair plastered to the sides of her face. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, but I kept the heavy deadbolt chain engaged, leaving only a narrow gap. I did not invite her inside. "Lauren, please," Amanda begged, her voice cracking as the rain poured down behind her. "Please let me in. I need to talk to you." "We have a legally mandated mediation session tomorrow at 9 in the morning," I said, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "You can say whatever you need to say to me across the table with your lawyer present." She reached out and gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles turning white. "You have to stop this," she cried, genuine panic radiating from her eyes. Derek tried to use his corporate credit card this morning to book a flight, and it was declined. His bank called and told him his business accounts have been temporarily frozen pending a legal review. "What did you do, Lauren? You are destroying us." I looked at my younger sister. For 35 years, she had been the golden child. She had manipulated our parents, bullied me, and taken whatever she wanted without ever facing a single consequence. She had literally stolen the keys to my car out of my purse just last week. And now the reality of the real world was finally crashing down on her. "I did not freeze his accounts, Amanda," I replied calmly. "Your husband committed federal tax evasion and money laundering a decade ago using my stolen inheritance. When my attorney subpoenaed those records, the automated fraud algorithms at his bank flagged the suspicious activity. The bank froze the accounts to protect themselves. I did not do this to you. Your own greed did. She started openly sobbing, tears mixing with the rain on her face. We did not know what Dad was doing, she lied, her voice rising in desperation. We did not know the money was yours. We just thought Dad was helping us out. Please, Lauren, you are my sister. Do not send my husband to prison. We will drop the lawsuit. We will give you the car back. Just call off your lawyers. I stared at her through the narrow gap in the door. I remembered her smirking at me at the steakhouse while my father handed me that fake invoice. I remembered her sitting in the luxury dealership perfectly willing to trade in my car to buy herself a Porsche. You forged my signature on the trust release forms 10 years ago. Amanda, I said quietly, do not stand on my porch and insult my intelligence by claiming you did not know. You knew exactly what you were doing, and tomorrow morning I am going to make sure you pay for it. I did not wait for her to respond. I firmly pushed the door shut, locking the heavy deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. I stood in my quiet hallway listening to her sob on my front porch for a few minutes before she finally gave up and walked back to her car in the pouring rain. They had left me in the cold once. Now it was their turn. I walked back to my home office, turned off the lights, and went to sleep completely ready for the massacre that was going to take place in the mediation room the next morning. Monday morning arrived with a cold, clear sky. I woke up at 6, my mind incredibly sharp and completely devoid of any lingering anxiety. I stood in front of my closet and selected a tailored charcoal gray suit. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a high-level corporate auditor walking into a hostile boardroom to dismantle a corrupt company. I grabbed my heavy briefcase, feeling the satisfying weight of the 3-inch thick binder inside. That binder was the culmination of a decade of lies, and I was about to force my family to read every single page. I met my attorney Rebecca Thorne in the marble lobby of the County Mediation Center precisely at 8:45. She looked flawless, in a navy blue suit carrying her own leather briefcase. We did not exchange pleasantries. We shared a single knowing look. We walked to the elevator and rode up to the 4th floor in absolute silence. The mediation center was a neutral ground designed to resolve civil disputes before they went to a formal trial. It consisted of long hallways lined with sterile glass-walled conference rooms that offered absolutely no privacy from the outside world. We opened the heavy oak door to Conference Room 4 and walked inside. My family was already there. Thomas sat at the head of the mahogany table wearing his best tailored suit, projecting his usual unearned arrogance. Susan sat next to him, her arms crossed tight over her chest, glaring at me as if I were a rebellious teenager who had just missed curfew. Amanda looked completely exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes betraying the panic from her visit to my porch the night before, but she still managed to lift her chin defensively. Derek sat beside her, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. Sitting next to my father was their attorney. He was an older man, in a cheap, slightly wrinkled suit, thumbing through a remarkably thin file folder. He looked bored, completely unaware of the absolute massacre that was about to take place. He clearly thought this was just a routine family squabble over unpaid personal loans. He had absolutely no idea his clients were using him as an active participant in a federal fraud scheme. Rebecca and I took our seats on the opposite side of the long mahogany table. We did not say hello. We did not engage in any small talk. Rebecca simply unlatched her briefcase and pulled out her legal notepad. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the floor, keeping the massive binder hidden for the moment. The court-appointed mediator, a quiet woman with thick glasses, officially opened the session. She explained that the goal today was to reach a financial settlement regarding the civil lawsuit my father had filed against me for $525,000. She reminded everyone that everything said in this room was legally documented, and then she turned the floor over to my father's attorney. The opposing lawyer cleared his throat and leaned forward. He spoke with a patronizing, condescending tone that immediately set my teeth on edge. He stated that his clients, Thomas and Susan, had made incredible financial sacrifices to raise me. He claimed that I had formally acknowledged this debt by signing a legally binding promissory note when I was 18 years old. He looked down at his notes and said my parents were willing to be generous. If I agreed to a structured payment plan starting with an immediate wire transfer of $50,000 today, they would drop the lawsuit and allow me to keep my accounting license without public embarrassment. Thomas actually smirked, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked at the mediator and stated that he just wanted his daughter to learn financial responsibility. He said it was time I stopped being so selfish and started supporting the family that gave me everything. Susan nodded in agreement, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. The mediator looked across the table at Rebecca and asked for our official response. Rebecca did not speak immediately. She turned to me and gave a slight affirming nod. This was my show. She was simply the heavily armed guard making sure no one broke the rules of the room. I reached down, unzipped my briefcase, and pulled out the massive 3-inch thick forensic audit binder. I dropped it right onto the center of the mahogany table. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet room. Everyone flinched. The smug smile instantly vanished from my father's face. Derek sat up completely straight, his eyes locked on the thick stack of papers with rising apprehension. I looked directly at their attorney. I told him that I was not going to pay my father a single dime. I told him that the lawsuit his clients had filed was entirely based on fraudulent, fabricated evidence. I reached across the table, opened the binder, and slid a single piece of paper out of the first section. It was a blown-up, high-resolution printed copy of the promissory note they had emailed me. I kept my voice perfectly flat and clinical, exactly the same tone I used when testifying in federal court against corporate embezzlers. I pointed to the text of the contract. I explained to their lawyer that my parents claimed this document was drafted and signed 17 years ago, but the specific typography used for the main body of the text was a font called Calibri Light. I pulled a certified document from the official Microsoft software release archives and slid it across the table. I explained that Microsoft did not release that specific font variation to the public until years after the date stamped at the top of their contract. I looked right at my father and stated that it was a digital forgery created exactly 5 days ago on a modern word processor. I did not stop there. I pulled another piece of paper from the binder. It was the state commission record for the notary public who had supposedly stamped my signature. I slid it over to their lawyer, resting it right on top of the fake contract. I explained that the man who stamped this document did not receive his notary license until exactly 5 years ago. I stated that it was a physical and legal impossibility for him to have notarized a document 17 years ago. The color completely drained from the older attorney's face. He picked up the Microsoft Archive printout and the state notary record. His hands began to shake slightly as he read the undeniable proof. In the legal profession, knowingly submitting a forged document to a judge is a fast track to permanent disbarment and criminal charges. He looked slowly to his left, staring at my father with absolute horror and rising, unbridled anger. Thomas turned bright red. He slammed his hand on the table, trying desperately to bluster his way out of the trap he had just sprung on himself. He shouted that the font on the paper did not matter. He frantically claimed the original paper got damaged by water years ago and they just retyped it for clarity, but that the debt itself was still completely real and legally binding. Susan chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked, yelling at the mediator that I was trying to use technicalities to get out of paying my own family back for my childhood groceries. I let them yell for exactly 10 seconds. I sat back in my chair and let them exhaust their fake, pathetic outrage. Then I raised my hand, silencing the room completely. I looked at my father and smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that finally made the reality of the situation sink into his brain. I told him that I was incredibly glad he brought up the topic of real documented debts. Because while they were busy using a modern computer to forge fake invoices and fake contracts to extort me, I had spent my entire weekend looking at their actual legally subpoenaed bank statements. I flipped open the massive binder to the second heavy divider tab. I looked past my father and locked eyes directly with Derek. The arrogance was completely gone from his face, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who suddenly realized he had left his front door wide open. I addressed the entire room, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. I told them that it was time we stopped talking about fake childhood invoices. I told them it was time we talked about a real legal document. It was time we talked about my grandfather's irrevocable generation skipping trust, and I wanted to know exactly where my $750,000 went. The absolute silence that fell over conference room 4 was thick enough to choke on. The mediator, who had been calmly taking notes on her laptop just moments before, slowly pulled her hands away from the keyboard. She looked across the mahogany table at my father with a deeply concerned, almost shocked expression. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn since walking into the building was completely wiped away. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to hit him. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I reached back into the massive binder and pulled out the county probate records. I slid the trust disbursement authorization across the table, placing it right next to the fake promissory note their lawyer had brought. I pointed a steady finger at the bottom right corner of the page. 10 years ago, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a surgical scalpel, someone forged my signature on this legal release form. This document explicitly instructed a private wealth management firm in Boston to liquidate an irrevocable trust established by my grandfather. A trust that was legally mandated to remain untouched until my 25th birthday. Their attorney leaned forward and picked up the paper. His hands were shaking visibly now. He looked at the forged signature on the trust document, and then looked down at the fake promissory note he had just tried to use against me. The identical, flawless blue ink signatures stared back at him. Any first-year law student could see they were identical digital copies. The wealth management firm executed the transfer based on this fraudulent authorization. I continued, making sure the mediator heard every single syllable. They wired exactly $1.5 million. But the money did not go to a secure trust account for me and Amanda. I pulled out the next document. It was my father's corporate bank statement from his logistics company, legally obtained through our aggressive subpoenas. I had highlighted the massive deposit in bright yellow ink. I pushed it across the table. The funds were wired directly into the operating account of Thomas's failing business, I said. He used $400,000 of my stolen inheritance to pay off his commercial creditors and avoid total bankruptcy. He used another massive portion to fund country club dues, designer clothing, and luxury vacations for himself and Susan. He literally stole my future to fund his fake socialite lifestyle. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. She pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak door as if she wanted to stand up and run, but I was not finished. The best part of a financial audit is tracing the final dollar, and I had saved the most devastating revelation for last. I turned my attention away from my parents and locked eyes with my brother-in-law. Derek was gripping the padded arms of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was staring at the thick binder in front of me as if it were a ticking bomb. But my father did not keep all the money, I said softly. He still had $350,000 of my money left, and he needed to hide it from the government, so he transferred it into a limited liability company. I slid the corporate registration papers across the mahogany table. A company called Apex Consulting Services, a company registered to and solely owned by Derek. Amanda whipped her head around to stare at her husband. "Derek," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "What is she talking about?" Derek did not look at her. He could not tear his eyes away from the documents I was laying out on the table. He knew exactly what was coming next. Derek was not just a passive recipient of stolen funds, I explained to the entire room. He actively helped launder the money. When you receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from a family member, you are required by law to pay a substantial federal gift tax. Derek wanted to avoid that tax, and he wanted to hide the origin of the money. So he classified my stolen inheritance as legitimate business revenue for his fake consulting firm. I pulled out Derek's federal tax returns from a decade ago and pushed them to the center of the table. To avoid paying income taxes on that fake revenue, Derek fabricated hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake business expenses, I said, tapping the tax returns with my index finger. He wrote off luxury car leases, expensive dinners, and personal vacations as corporate operating costs. He washed my money completely clean through his fake business, withdrew the laundered cash, and used it to pay the pure cash down payment for the house Amanda currently lives in. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I looked directly into Derek's terrified, wide eyes. "That is federal wire fraud, Derek," I said, my voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. "That is corporate tax evasion. That is money laundering. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division does not offer structured payment plans for that kind of intentional fraud. They offer mandatory sentences of 5 to 10 years in federal prison." The sound that came out of Amanda was something between a scream and a sob. She shoved her chair back, standing up so fast the chair almost tipped over. She slammed her hands on the table and turned entirely on Derek. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, asking him if it was true. She demanded to know if their entire house, their entire comfortable life was bought with illegal money that was going to send him to federal prison. Derek just sat there completely paralyzed, staring at the tax returns that proved his absolute guilt. But the most decisive and satisfying reaction came from the man sitting at the end of the table. The cheap attorney my parents had hired to bully me slowly stood up. He did not look angry anymore. He looked terrified for his own legal career and his own freedom. He gathered the fake promissory note and the forged trust release form, sliding them quickly back across the table toward me. He refused to even touch them for another second. He looked directly at the mediator, who was furiously typing notes into her laptop to officially document the session. "Let the record reflect," the attorney said, his voice loud and shaking, "that I am formally withdrawing as legal counsel for Thomas and Susan, effective immediately." I was not made aware of any of these documents or these financial transactions prior to this mediation session. I cannot and will not represent clients who have actively engaged in federal fraud and submitted fabricated evidence to this court. He snapped his briefcase shut. He did not look at my father. He did not say a single word of goodbye to my mother. He turned around, walked briskly out of the glass-walled conference room, and practically ran down the hallway toward the elevators. His departure broke whatever fragile restraint was left in the room. Absolute unhinged chaos erupted. Amanda started hitting Derek on the shoulder, sobbing hysterically, screaming that he had ruined her life and that she was going to lose her beautiful house. Derek finally snapped out of his paralysis, his face turning red with rage. He yelled back at her that her own father was the one who stole the money in the first place and that he was just trying to help them get a house because she refused to get a real job. They were viciously tearing each other apart right in front of me, the perfect suburban facade they had maintained for 10 years, completely shattered into a million pieces. My father buried his face in his hands, resting his elbows on the table. The arrogant, condescending man who had slid a $525,000 invoice across my dinner plate on my birthday was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man who suddenly realized he was going to lose his business, his reputation, and his freedom. And then there was Susan, my mother, the woman who had happily watched her husband steal my car, the woman who had left me a venomous, threatening voicemail. Just days prior, completely broke down. She began hyperventilating, heavy tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. She practically threw herself across the mahogany table toward me, reaching out as if she wanted to grab my hands. "Lauren, please," she wailed, her voice thick with panic and pure desperation. "Please, you have to stop this. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your father to prison. We raised you. We gave you everything." I sat perfectly still, watching my family completely implode. I felt my attorney Rebecca watching me carefully from the corner of her eye, waiting to see if I would show any sign of weakness or familial guilt. But there was absolutely no weakness left inside me. The tears, the screaming, the desperate begging, it all meant absolutely nothing. They were not sorry they stole my future. They were not sorry they had treated me like a financial burden my entire life. They were only sorry they had finally been caught by the daughter they chronically underestimated. I sat perfectly still, watching my mother sob and hyperventilate across the mahogany table. She kept repeating that we were family, that we shared the same blood, and that I could not possibly destroy my own father. I did not reach out to hold her hand. I did not offer her a single tissue. I simply looked at her ruined makeup and let the heavy silence stretch until her desperate pleas dissolved into pathetic, breathless hiccups. "Family does not forge signatures to steal a child's future," I said, my voice cutting through the sterile air of the conference room. "Family does not watch their daughter freeze in a cheap college apartment, starving and drowning in student loans while sitting on a stolen fortune. You did not raise me, Susan. You tolerated me. And the moment you thought you could squeeze me for $500,000 to buy your golden child a new mansion, you threw me to the wolves." My father. Thomas finally lifted his face from his hands. He was desperate, grasping at invisible straws, his mind racing to find any possible loophole. "Lauren, listen to me." He stammered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "You cannot prove I requested that transfer. It was a decade ago. It could have been a bank error. The wealth management firm in Boston could have made a mistake with the routing numbers and accidentally sent it to my logistics company. You have no hard proof that I orchestrated it." I actually smiled at him. It was the pitiful, predictable defense of a cornered criminal who truly believed he was smarter than the digital age. I turned to my attorney Rebecca, who was sitting beside me with a look of absolute predatory satisfaction. She gave me a slight nod. I reached back into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of specialized forensic cyber reports. I dropped them onto the table and slid them directly over to my father. "I am a forensic accountant, Dad," I reminded him softly. "I do not deal in assumptions. I deal in digital footprints. When you submitted the forged trust release forms to the wealth management firm 10 years ago, you did not use the postal service. You submitted them through their secure online client portal." I tapped my index finger against the top page of the cyber report. "The firm keeps detailed security logs of every single document upload. I subpoenaed those logs. They provided the exact Internet Protocol address, the IP address of the computer that uploaded the forged documents bearing my fake signature." I watched the last remaining drop of color completely drain from his face. I cross-referenced that specific IP address with the Internet Service Provider records from 10 years ago. I continued, my words landing like heavy stones. "The digital footprint points directly to the wireless router registered to your home office. You sat at your desk in the house I grew up in, scanned the forged documents, and pushed the upload button. It was not a bank error. It was calculated, premeditated federal wire fraud, and I have the exact timestamp to prove it." Thomas sank back into his leather chair, completely deflated. The fight was entirely gone from him. He stared blindly at the ceiling, realizing that every single lie he had ever told was comprehensively documented and sitting in a binder right in front of him. But I was not going to let the room breathe. I turned my attention back to the man sitting next to my sister. Derek had been unusually quiet since the opposing attorney had sprinted out of the room. He was staring at the fake limited liability company tax returns I had exposed earlier, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. He slowly placed his hands on the table and made a subtle motion to push his chair back, as if he were preparing to quietly stand up and walk out the door. Rebecca spoke up for the first time since the session began. "I would not advise leaving this room, Derek," she said, her tone sharp and authoritative, "unless you are rushing home to pack a bag for federal holding." Derek froze, his eyes darting toward her. I pulled the tax documents closer to the center of the table and looked dead into his panicked eyes. "Let us talk about your federal penalties, Derek," I said, adopting a cold, clinical tone, "because I want you to understand exactly what is going to happen when I hand this binder over to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." Amanda grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket, but he was too terrified to even look at her. Under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343, wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison per count, I explained. And because you received the stolen funds through a series of structured electronic wire transfers, the government will charge you with multiple counts. Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "But that is not even the worst part," I continued smoothly. "You did not just receive the money, you actively washed it through Apex Consulting Services. You filed fraudulent corporate tax returns for 3 consecutive years to hide the stolen inheritance from the government. You wrote off a luxury ski trip to Aspen as a marketing convention. You wrote off a $10,000 diamond tennis bracelet for Amanda as a corporate client gift." I slid the itemized expense reports right up to his fingertips. "Tax evasion carries a sentence of up to 5 years per count. Money laundering carries up to 20 years. When the federal prosecutors look at this binder, they are not going to see a desperate family man. They are going to see a sophisticated, calculated white-collar criminal. You are looking at decades in a federal penitentiary, Derek. You are going to lose your career, your freedom, and the house you bought with my money." Absolute chaos erupted all over again. Amanda let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She completely lost her mind, slamming both of her hands violently against Derek's chest. "You idiot!" she shrieked, her face twisted in absolute fury. "You told me you took care of the paperwork. You told me we were safe. You laundered the money through a fake company. Are you insane? You are going to go to prison and leave me with absolutely nothing." Derek finally snapped. The sheer terror of his impending doom shattered his arrogant facade, and he aggressively pushed Amanda's hands away from him. He stood up, towering over her, his face dark red with rage. "Do not sit there and play the innocent victim, Amanda," he roared, his voice shaking the glass walls of the conference room. "You knew exactly where that money came from." The entire room went dead silent. Even my mother stopped sobbing to look at him. Amanda's eyes went wide with pure panic. She frantically shook her head, holding her hands up. "Shut up, Derek," she hissed, terrified of what he was about to put on the official record. But Derek was past the point of damage control. If he was going down, he was going to take the golden child with him. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my sister. "You wanted that massive house in the suburbs," he yelled. "You demanded the heated pool and the custom kitchen. When your dad offered us the cash, I asked you where he got $350,000 while his business was failing. And you laughed. You literally laughed and told me he broke into the trust fund your grandfather left for Lauren." I looked at Amanda, my perfect spoiled sister who had spent her entire life acting morally superior, was completely exposed. "You told me Lauren was too stupid to ever figure it out," Derek continued, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "You signed the forged release form right next to him. You helped him steal it, and then you begged me to figure out a way to hide the cash so the IRS would not audit us. You are just as guilty as I am." Amanda completely collapsed into her chair. She covered her face with her hands and began to wail. It was a horrible, ugly sound. The perfect suburban marriage built entirely on my stolen inheritance was violently disintegrating right in front of my eyes. They were tearing each other to shreds to save themselves. My father tried to intervene, standing up on shaky legs. He looked at me, completely ignoring his crying wife and his screaming daughter. He was only focused on his own survival. Lauren, please. Thomas begged, his voice dropping into a desperate conspiratorial whisper. Listen to me. We do not need to involve the federal government. We do not need to send Derek or Amanda to prison. Let us make a deal right now. I will sign the logistics company over to you. I will empty my retirement accounts. I will give you everything I have. Just close the binder, please. Just let us walk away. I looked at the man who had handed me an itemized bill for my childhood groceries. I looked at the man who had stolen my car out of sheer spite. I looked at the golden child who had mocked me, and the brother-in-law who had told me to call an Uber in the freezing rain. The mediator sat frozen at the end of the table, her hands resting on her lap, completely shocked by the massive criminal confession she had just witnessed and documented. I slowly reached out and closed the heavy cover of the 3-inch thick binder. The loud smack of the leather cover echoed with absolute finality. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single one of them, letting them feel the absolute weight of their total destruction. They had walked into this room expecting to force me into a payment plan. Instead, they had just confessed to federal crimes on the official record. I do not want your failing logistics company, Dad, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I do not want secret deals or fake apologies. I turned to Rebecca, who slid a single crisp sheet of paper from her folder and placed it exactly in the center of the table. It was not a settlement offer, it was a list of demands. I am going to dictate exactly what happens next, I told them, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands. And if you hesitate for even a single second, my lawyer walks straight out of this building and hands this binder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I looked at the single crisp sheet of paper resting in the center of the mahogany table. It was my turn to hand out an invoice. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I looked directly at my father, who was staring blindly at the document. I told him that I wanted the immediate full return of my $750,000 trust fund. But I was not stopping there. I demanded 10 years of compounded interest at a standard market rate to account for the decade of investment growth they had stolen from me. I demanded the immediate transfer of the state title back to my Audi and the full unconditional reimbursement of every single dollar I had spent on my attorney to untangle their web of lies. The grand total, printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page, was exactly $1.2 million. My mother let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her chest. 1.2 million, she choked out, her face pale and streaked with ruined mascara. Lauren, we do not have that kind of liquid cash. You know we do not. We will be ruined. We will have to sell everything we own. I looked at her with absolutely zero pity. That is exactly what you will do, I replied smoothly. I am giving you exactly 30 days to produce the funds. I do not care how you get it. You can liquidate your retirement accounts, you can sell your business, you can pawn your jewelry, and you can sell your houses. If the full $1.2 million is not sitting in my attorney's escrow account by 5:00 on the 30th day, we will walk the unredacted forensic audit binder straight to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the local federal field office. Derek opened his mouth, perhaps to threaten me one last time, but no words came out. He looked at the fake corporate tax returns sitting on the table and realized his life was entirely in my hands. Amanda was rocking back and forth in her chair, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. My father just slowly nodded his head, completely broken. There would be no extensions. There would be no further negotiations. I stood up, smoothed out my tailored suit jacket, and placed the massive binder back into my heavy leather briefcase. My attorney packed her notes, gave the terrified family one last cold glance, and followed me out the door. We walked out of the mediation center and out into the bright morning sun, leaving them sitting in the total wreckage of their own arrogant choices. The next 30 days were a frantic, humiliating scramble for my family. Without a lawyer to protect them, and with the very real threat of federal prison hanging over their heads like a guillotine, they had to systematically dismantle the entire fake empire they had built with my money. Derek and Amanda were forced to list their massive luxury house for a quick cash sale. Because they were desperate to meet my 30-day deadline, they could not wait for a competitive market offer. They had to take a massive financial loss selling the property to a corporate flipper for hundreds of thousands of dollars under market value. The stress of losing her perfect suburban mansion, combined with the extreme public humiliation of packing moving boxes in front of her wealthy neighbors, was too much for Amanda to handle. The golden child finally cracked. She blamed Derek for being stupid enough to leave a paper trail on his fake tax returns. Derek furiously blamed her for the original theft, reminding her every single day that she was the one who laughed while forging my signature. Their marriage imploded spectacularly. By the second week of the liquidation process, the screaming matches had become so severe that the local police were called to their house for a noise complaint. Derek packed his bags and moved into a cheap, run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. Amanda was forced to consult a divorce attorney she could barely afford, officially ending their toxic partnership. My parents did not fare any better. My father had to completely liquidate his failing logistics company. I monitored the public business filings with immense satisfaction as he sold off his delivery trucks, his warehouse equipment, and his remaining corporate accounts just to scrape together his portion of my stolen inheritance. He was forced to lay off his remaining staff and close the doors on the business he had built his entire identity around. Susan had to swallow her massive pride and endure the ultimate social humiliation. She was forced to sell her designer jewelry auction off her luxury sport utility vehicle and officially cancel the exclusive country club membership that defined her entire existence. They could no longer afford the property taxes on my childhood home. They sold the pristine colonial house and moved into a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, far away from the wealthy friends she used to desperately try to impress. The perfect family facade was completely gone, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the financial ruin they had originally tried to dump on me. On the 29th day at exactly 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from my bank. A massive wire transfer had successfully cleared into my primary checking account. The balance updated instantly: $1.2 million. An hour later, a private courier arrived at my front door holding a thick, rigid envelope. Inside was the signed, notarized state title to my Audi Q5, legally transferring full ownership back into my name. They had completely surrendered. They had paid their debt. But I did not keep the Audi. The very next morning, I drove the pristine white vehicle straight back to the same luxury imported auto dealership where Amanda had tried to trade it in. I walked right through the heavy glass doors, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I walked right past the young salesman who had tried to help Amanda, heading directly for the general manager's elevated glass office. I sat down at his desk, placed the legal title in front of him, and told him I was ready to make a purchase. I used the premium trade in equity from the Audi, along with a small portion of my recovered trust fund, to buy the exact brand new fully loaded Porsche Macan my sister had been drooling over. I paid the remainder entirely in pure cash. I drove it off the lot that same afternoon, the smell of fresh leather and the roar of the engine serving as the perfect conclusion to my absolute victory. Now it is 6 months later. I am sitting in the sunroom of my quiet, beautiful townhouse. The morning light is pouring through the massive windows, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors. I am drinking a cup of premium black coffee, looking out at my perfectly manicured garden. The toxic, suffocating weight of my family is completely gone from my life. I have not spoken to them since the day we walked out of the mediation room. Suddenly, my phone buzzes on the glass coffee table. I look down at the glowing screen. It is an incoming call from an unknown number. I do not answer it. I let it ring until it goes to voicemail. A minute later, the automated audio transcription pops up on my screen. It is my mother. I can read the words as the software transcribes her shaking, pathetic voice. She is sobbing about how small and cold their new apartment is. She says my father's health is declining from the stress of losing his business. She says Amanda is struggling to pay her rent now that Derek is gone. She is begging me to just loan them a few $1,000s to help cover their monthly utility bills. She ends the voicemail by saying how much she misses me and that families should always find a way to forgive each other. I listened to the actual audio message for exactly 3 seconds. I listened to her fake tears and her desperate manipulation, and then I press delete. I permanently block the number. I stand up from my comfortable chair, pick up the heavy keys to my brand new Porsche, grab my designer coat, and walk out the door into the bright open future that I built entirely on my own. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members who only valued you for what they could extract from you? Have you ever had to set an unbreakable boundary to protect your own peace and sanity? Let me know how you handled it in the comments below. And if my story brought you some satisfaction today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your worth and standing up for yourself. Remember, you do not owe your peace, your money, or your future to anyone who is willing to destroy you to build themselves up. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.